today's webinar, How Indiana's Communities Can Leverage the American Rescue Plan. Since the ARP was signed by President Biden in March, every local government leader has been challenged by determining how these unprecedented funds will be impacting their communities. This historic funding allows for a meaningful investment in communities and allows more than 3 years for communities to strategically plan and deploy the funds. In late March, Okra did a survey of local government leaders to help us determine what role our agency should play in assisting in best implementing these funds. And the response showed that the leaders are looking for guidance in this work. And today's webinar is our first response to that effort. Thanks to our partners, Accelerate Indiana Municipalities, the Association of Indiana Counties, and the Indiana Association of Regional Councils. And we are pleased to have with us Bruce Katz today. Bruce Katz is the founding director of the Norwalk Metro Finance Lab at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Previously, he served as an inaugural Centennial Scholar at Brookings Institute and as vice president and director of Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program for more than 20 years. He is co-author of The New Localism, How Cities Can Thrive in the Age of Populism. Since March, Mr. Katz has published a number of articles, including Deploying the American Rescue Plan and from federal sources to local uses, Maximizing the American Rescue Plans from the ground up. If you have any questions, please enter them into the chat feature and they will be moderated as times allow. So it's my privilege to introduce Bruce Katz. Welcome, Bruce.
Well, thanks, Denny. And sorry I had a little difficulty getting on with the WebEx. Living on Zoom most of the time these days. And I've been joined by Colin Higgins, who's a research officer at the NOAC lab at Drexel University. I think that we have a deck that we're going to post and then walk through. But what we've been doing over the last several months is we have basically created a federal investment guide, which I'll walk through, which really disaggregates all the different bits of the American Rescue Plan. And we've begun to sort out how cities and counties set up command centers. So I'll start walking through this, and then Colin will join to discuss our work on the command centers. So next slide, and thank you, Mary, for doing this. So just some context, which we all know, and I'll go quickly through this. This is the largest shock since the Great Depression. It's had a particular character, though, compared to other recessions, particularly the last Great Recession, because this is a small business-led recession because of the nature of the impact of the pandemic. But we are witnessing the largest economic opportunity for scalable investment and a myriad of investments because of the American Rescue Plan and potentially the American Jobs Plan to follow. But if cities are going to harness this, counties are going to harness this, they're going to have to coordinate and align and prioritize and think not just about funds that are going directly to general purpose local governments, but a whole myriad of funds that may be going through public authorities or to the state or the school district. So next slide. Still on the context side, and I think many people on the call will appreciate this. There is a crisis for central business districts because of what central districts represent in the spatial geography of our economy and work. Because of the shutdowns and because central business districts concentrate hospitality, office work, convention centers, entertainment, they have been hard hit. They're almost ghost towns in many parts of the country. The question is whether the remote work that has been accelerated will continue post-pandemic, and even a 10%, 20%, 30% shift of office workers to some kind of remote work will have a dramatic effect on downtowns. And if downtowns don't come back, then we're going to see a domino effect. Tax revenues, small business, transit commutes. Next slide. As I said before, the effect on the small business sector, and particularly businesses owned by people of color, because they tend to be concentrated in sectors that were hardest hit, has been most dramatic. We have seen the federal government try to respond with a litany of loan products or grants. Those have generally worked, but in the initial rollout of many of these loan products, the Paycheck Protection Program particularly because Black and Latino businesses are small scale, tend to be undercapitalized, tend to be underbanked. They have been not as helped. And also, we are seeing the dominance of e-commerce, and that could have, like the remote work piece, could have a long tail post-pandemic. Next slide. So as we go forward here, and as you're thinking about the deployment of American Rescue Plan, because of this disproportionate impact on small businesses in general, and Black and Latino businesses in particular, what we should be thinking about post-pandemic is an ecosystem approach that would focus on supplier diversity. How can funds being used or being allocated by the national government be put in the service of small business, local government, reducing barriers to business startup and scaling, mentoring, nurturing business services, the right kind of capital to the right firms, commercial corridors, whether they're central business districts, whether they're around university areas, whether they're general nodes of commerce, and sector focus of upgrading and diversifying particular sectors. Next slide. So that gets us to the rescue plan. This is unprecedented, this is historic, and there is an enormous opportunity here to harness funds, not just in the abstract, but in the service of priorities that are set locally at the metropolitan level. Next slide. The federal investment guide that we put out with Accelerator for America, U.S. Conference of Mayors, is, I think, a must read, because what we've taken is 84 programs over 19 agencies via 7 different distribution methods: block grants to general purpose governments, block grants to the states, block grants to public authorities, competitive grants, tax incentives. We've broken all that down. So it's basically can be understood by distribution method. The way the media has reported on much of the American Rescue Plan, they sort of seize on the label of a particular program, and then that seems to be the be-all and the end-all for, let's say, small business. They label anything coming out of SBA, small business, but there's a lot more in this plan that could be in the service of that. So this is the breakdown. A good portion of the funds, not surprisingly, goes for individual relief, the $1,400 stimulus checks. But then you see large amounts of money flowing to states, flowing to public authorities, flowing to general purpose local governments, and then on and on. The key here is to set priorities. This is not about the federal government dictating how many places actually spend their funds. In some ways, it's the reverse. It's local leaders set priorities and then match sources of federal money to local uses. Next slide. This is how the federal government operates. Everyone on this call knows it. It's very specialized. It's very compartmentalized. It's very vertical. So again, we have 84 programs moving across multiple agencies that think in silos and stovepipes. It hits the ground, and that's where you begin to see cities and counties across multiple sectors, across multiple parts of the public sector, general purpose government, public authorities, school districts, and beyond, beginning to braid and blend all this together. This is why we need command centers to bring some order out of what would otherwise be very vertically oriented, specialized spending. We need to get our arms around this, understand it, but more importantly, put it in the service of local priorities. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it to Colin to talk through these command centers, but I would highly urge you, and as we go through Q&A, get a hold of this federal investment guide, begin to understand both the complexity of distribution channels coming, but also the ability of cities and counties to declare your priorities and then match local uses to national sources. Colin.
Thanks, Bruce. And just to pick up right there, we have been for the last couple months calling for the creation of these stimulus command centers before we knew what was in the American Rescue Plan, but with the understanding that The federal government tends to operate one way, and that way doesn't always serve local communities in the way that they solve problems. And so the stimulus command centers, put quite simply, are sort of 18-month executive style task forces focused on making sure that the recovery is equitable and the recovery works for your communities. What they are in a bit more detail is, run either out of City Hall, out of the county executives building, in partnership with key local players. And this is key, right? That it can't just be government doing all the work. So much of this money through the federal investment guide goes through different public authorities. Some of it doesn't even pass through local government or public authorities. It just goes straight to businesses, straight to individuals, but they need to know the process of applying. And so what the command center is, it's a small group set up for 18 months to say, these are the 3 to 5 priorities we have. This is what we want as a community to come out of the recovery and to come out of the recovery stronger. Here are the uses we want to, here's what we want to do with this money. And then it goes about the process, as Bruce mentioned, of connecting those local uses to the federal sources and really cutting through and trying to navigate through the red tape that we all know exists and making sure those funds land on the ground. Right now, these command centers are very much a dry run for what will likely be a future infrastructure package. But priority one is crisis managing the distribution of American Rescue Plan funds. We've sort of put together, as Bruce mentioned, this roadmap in the federal investment guide. But this is really phase one. This should be thought of as sort of a sequence of investments that really lay the groundwork for the next 10 to 20 years of the economy in your communities. Next slide, please. So what are some other communities, other cities, other towns doing? There are a wide array of organizing these. The 3 examples we have in Cleveland, St. Louis, and Cincinnati, all of these are innovative because they're led by civic business partnerships working hand in glove with the local government. There are other examples. We're working with the U.S. Conference of Mayors and with Accelerator for America in 7 different cities, where it's really city-driven and it comes out of City Hall and they are seeking partnerships and it's really run out of the mayor's office. Cleveland Innovation Project, Greater STL Inc., and Cincinnati Regenerator Alliance. It's a group of businesses, a group of civic organizations, a group of labor organizations have come together and said, this past year, right, it really highlighted the way that our system is fragmented and that it fails neighborhoods, fails Black and brown communities, fails those who are most vulnerable. We are putting our resources on the table. We're putting a list of uses on the table that we want this money to go to. And then we're coming to City Hall and getting their buy-in and really helping to run this. The key here, again, is stimulus command centers. It's not just the city saying we're designating a stimulus czar. That's important. What is more important is making sure that there's that partnership model, that collaborative model, that network to run not only the public money, but to bring private money, to bring philanthropic money to help build capacity. And again, the key here, as always, is articulating priorities. It's very easy to get overwhelmed by the scale of the American Rescue Plan, by the amount of new uses, and to get distracted by the jobs and infrastructure plan that's on the horizon. The cities that are focused, the cities that have clear priorities, and the cities that bring key players to the table around those priorities, those will be the places that really win in this rescue and recovery. Next slide, please. So here's just one of the examples. We've talked about matching sources and uses, and this is just to illustrate both the complexity and how you can bring some order out of the complexity with a key set of stakeholders in a stimulus command center. And so we've highlighted minority business relief and growth coming out of the pandemic. If this is a priority of your town, of your city, which it is in many places that we talk to, right? There are many different sources that you can use, some of which are explicitly labeled small business, right? There's shuttered venue relief, there's the PPP. Some of them are more complicated, right? There is public K-12 emergency relief, which can be used for HVAC renovation in schools. That's not immediately a small business priority, but there are a lot of construction firms specifically that specialize in providing HVAC system, and many Latino-owned, Black-owned businesses around the country are located in the construction center, and deployed correctly, this can not only help modernize schools, but it can help build wealth and close the racial wealth gap in our country. What that requires, again, is an entity to help set priorities, direct the funds to key priorities, right? If supplier diversity in construction is a key priority, really having someone who wakes up and focuses on making sure that the barriers are cleared for that, and making sure that private and philanthropic money comes to the table. But again, it requires continuously specifying the type of uses, right? Not just supplier diversity, but then supplier diversity in construction. And then beyond that, creating a supplier diversity intermediary to help facilitate this passage from, ARP source to local use. And I'm going to pass it back to Bruce, who can talk a bit about the work we're doing in Philly to help establish a supplier diversity intermediary, and also think through the broader small business implications and recovery playbooks that we're working on.
Yeah, so in Philadelphia and elsewhere, particularly in Dayton and Birmingham, we've created this recovery playbook tool. You can actually access it through a small business equity toolkit that MasterCard is hosting right now. And this essentially builds on exactly what Colin was just saying. Cities thinking about the ecosystem of small business stabilization and small business growth, supplier diversity, entrepreneurial support, capital access, commercial corridors, sector diversification, and then in each part of that ecosystem, making the kind of investments or leveraging up private and civic capital so that you can help businesses that will still be struggling, just given the uncertainty and difficulty of the rebound. So there are many sources out here that we think could be quite helpful to you. In Philadelphia, just to build on how we're organizing ourselves, the mayor already had a recovery center that was set up when the city of Philadelphia began to receive funding from the CARES Act directly, because it's a very large city. What is now happening is that an alliance of business, labor groups, universities, hospitals, business chambers are helping the mayor move beyond just the funding that's going directly to the city and accessing, harnessing, drawing down, then leveraging all the other sources of funding that we just described. Now, our focus in Philadelphia, as in these other cities, is very much around small business. Now, that's not the only issue, obviously, to be addressed here, given the rise of homelessness in many cities, given the rise of gun violence in many cities, et cetera, et cetera. But small business in particular, which dramatically affects nodes of commerce, corridors, business districts, main streets, is almost tailor fit to the way the American Rescue Plan is organized. Next slide. Well, thank you. But I think what we'd like to do is open it up. I think the most important thing is to take your questions and to make sure that these resources are made available to you as quickly as possible, because devil in the details, on this American Rescue Plan. There's a lot in here. It can absolutely be understood and mastered, but it won't happen from just one particular governmental entity or public authority or private and civic organization. This is a networked approach that ultimately has to be modeled here if each of your communities are going to leverage the full impact. So let me open up to questions, and Andrea and others, we're happy to start putting in the chat these particular sources.
Great, yeah, we have the first question today. Just everybody, so that you'll have to remain muted. So to ask your question, you have to put it in the chat box so that we can moderate it that way. But the first question that we have is, many of our participants are rural communities, so how do they best partner with other local units of government to best leverage this opportunity?
Well, I think for rural communities, obviously there's multiple kinds of partnerships that need to be drawn. First of all, with the state, because rural communities may be receiving a portion of these funds, as other communities, through the state governments. Secondly, the question should be, and other places are beginning to explore this, multi-municipal collaboration. Because in some parts of the country, there are multiple municipalities which are receiving their own funds. And then the question should be, okay, well, the economy does not stop at the border. So again, it gets to this question of priorities. Perfect is the enemy of the good. For a group of municipalities that want to come together, is there a driving issue that unites all of you? It could be a corridor question, right? It could be a sector of the economy that has been disrupted. Can you pull together around that issue? And that's separate and apart from a rural community or any community making investments to fill budget holes or provide fiscal relief and keep the services of government moving. But I would say the state is going to play a very big role here. But there is this potential for multi-municipal collaboration and collaboration with counties. Because it's the United States, assume that we will have every permutation possible. There won't be one norm or model. It'll be all across the board. So you need to pick and choose what fits your own structure and your own set of priorities.
I think that the one thing I would add in addition to that is, there are large pots of money that don't necessarily run through the government and are targeted towards rural communities, right? The USDA has a number of programs that are targeted for debt relief for farmers. In addition, they have a $5 billion pot of money that they're still specifying what the specific uses of that will be. And they have community facilities grants that they're running as well, some of which doesn't need to touch government. And so again, to Bruce's point on multi-municipal partnerships, I would add the two other actors you really need to be considering are just individuals, making them aware that they can and should be applying for some of these programs, right? Similar to PPP, similar to some of the small business relief, you just got to get the word out and make sure people apply. The second element is, the business community and the private sector in rural areas can really support some of this capacity for putting together a plan, especially for leveraging some of these economic development funds, even in lower capacity communities where there isn't necessarily the staff of a large city.
Thank you. One of the questions is, can cities, school systems, hospitals, and counties combine their funds to help each other with projects?
Absolutely. Obviously, we all know the federal government, right? There are going to be different rules, different reporting requirements for different streams of funding. To the greatest extent possible, however, it is anticipated that there will be braiding and blending of funds so that you can realize your full potential. Let me just give you one example where you can begin to combine up. As we look towards the small business recovery, again, it's been a small business-led recession of sorts. Funding is going to go through different public agencies, school districts, and authorities. Each of those separate entities have to procure goods and services. Colin mentioned the HVAC systems in our schools. So the question is whether you could have one intermediary that cuts across all these agencies, school districts, and authorities and provides help to making sure that procurement policies support small businesses and in major urban areas in particular, Black and brown owned businesses, supplier diversity. So that's an example of how a platform that cuts across multiple forms of government could advance one singular purpose, which is small business. And I do think that we all know that in many parts of the country and in many sectors, procurement tilts towards larger firms. But this, again, has been a pandemic that has really destroyed, decimated, devastated these small businesses. So this is a way to course correct. That's one way in which you can move across multiple sources.
And I think the added point there is what we've seen is sort of smaller and mid-sized communities are actually better positioned to braid these funds because their politics are slightly less complicated than, right? We're doing work in Philly and LA, and they're just slower to move because there are a lot more people to move there. And smaller cities, right, your Daytons, your Birminghams are able to more quickly assemble people and think through how to braid these funds in order to pull them down and do a project that everyone wants to do. It is, I think the one caveat there is the federal government is still specifying what the eligible uses and reporting requirements and all the strings that come with federal money. So I wouldn't go out spending a bunch of money on stuff before the rules come out. But I think to Bruce's point, braiding is something that should happen, and that's what will facilitate the really transformative impact of these funds.
Do you have any practical tips for collaboration and how to avoid partisan obstacles or silos, egos getting in the way of this opportunity?
Well, these are the rules of the sandbox, right? That I assume, though when I remember the sandbox I was in, it was pretty brutal. But in any event, I think collaboration, has to be focused on areas of common interest. At the end of the day, there's not going to be collaboration on everything. It's just not the way the world works, and it's not the way our country works. But the question is whether there is this one or two challenges or opportunities that really define your community or define multiple communities, and whether folks can basically park a whole bunch of stuff in the near term to come around those one or two priorities. I think that's the only way we're going to go forward. Most parts of the U.S., what we always say, in terms of collaboration is people don't need to love each other to work together. You do need to want to achieve similar goals. This funding is giving that possibility. It ain't perfect. And by the way, it's on top of the general distribution of federal funds that is annually appropriated and other tax incentives that are annually made available. So the American Rescue Plan is not the be all and the end all. It comes on top of the rest of the federal government.
All right. Another question that we got is the township trustees, how will they be able to tap into these funds, if at all? Is it something they can participate in, or are they kind of left out of this?
What is the role of a township trustee?
Because this is different in every state, right?
It differs everywhere, yeah.
The township trustee is an elected position, but they, I guess I'm probably not the best person to explain this, but they just have a position that's part of a county, but it's not part of county government. So I think they would have to go through their county in order to tap into these funds.
My recommendation to many folks on the phone, it's something that I learned when I served in the federal government, is there is a need to understand a myriad of funding that is flowing here. And what's happening, and you already see it in the media, is it is so big that they tend to focus on just a few things. They either focus on the $1,400 stimulus checks, that is going to be distributed very efficiently, or they focus on the funds that go directly to the state, the counties, or municipalities for fiscal relief, and if any money is left over, flexible investments in areas that were affected by the pandemic. That leaves about 83 other programs. So my recommendation to trustees and others is, once you go through the federal investment guide and once you begin to sort of match it to the priorities and the challenges that your place is facing, then really become, one of the quote unquote experts in the community and in the state on how that funding is flowing. I think that's going to be the secret here. Everyone is moving towards these initial block grant funds that go to state and local aid, essentially, that will come out May 11th. Well, that leaves an incredible amount of funding, right? That is still there to be allocated and harnessed for local purpose. So I think trustees and others can really become the go-to people around how that all works. And these connectors, these networkers are going to be radically needed throughout the country.
I think just to underscore that point, I mean, especially if the given that the trustees are elected positions, right? They have a lot of the relationships in the community that can bring people to the table and help, to the other point of getting people out of their silos, getting people out of sort of, the fights that they've been having for the last 10 years. It's really go through the federal investment guide and go where people are not, right? Everyone is focused on this sort of city and county fiscal relief. Nobody's focused on the $3 billion in EDA money that require a grant application and require sitting down and getting people around the table and saying, what are we going to use this EDA money for? What's our plan? Who's applying? What do we need to apply? Do we need an extra grant writer to help actually go through and do this? Okay, how are we going to get funding for that? Right? There are a whole bunch of steps in the process where even though the funding may not be going directly through the township trustee, with a clear understanding of the guide and understanding where the different source comes into what you want to do on the ground, right? You can sort of get ahead of the rescue plan and really drive it to your use.
Okay, one last question. What is a realistic time frame for the planning and collaboration to occur?
Well, I think there are stages and sequencing of planning and coordination, collaboration. I wouldn't wait a long time. I mean, I would start now. And you can start by just getting the right people around a table, public, private, civic. And again, Indiana, like every state, you have your own forms of government and your own powers. I mean, this is, we got 50 states. We almost have like 50 nations, really. So get the right people around the table. Begin to articulate, start with however many priorities that people put forward. And then try to narrow them down so it's a manageable list. And then begin to look at these sources and say, well, we could apply for that. Or perhaps there's a set of funding that's already coming to our jurisdiction or our county, et cetera, that we could engage with to leverage this moment. And by the way, we haven't suspended private capital or the market economy, right? I mean, a lot of this funding that's coming will only work if it leverages private capital, the banks, financial institutions, and other sources of funding. So I think the first order of business is to set the table. Maybe the priorities are obviously, are just so clear already, just given the nature of the pandemic and the implications it's had, that it'll be easy to set the first initial set of priorities. But then you do this matchmaking exercise. I mean, in the chat here, our rural community has a need for a new fire station. I mean, that's a certain kind of use, right? Which of the sources might be able to be put to that? In some urban communities, they are talking about using the flexible sources for food markets or for restoration of iconic historic buildings. So, in the end of the day, it's what is the local need? and then trying to match to the federal source. I think that exercise will prepare you well also for the American Jobs Plan, because that's coming soon, hopefully. And that's going to be a very big investment in infrastructure. So if you can't fund your priority need out of the rescue plan, it could be that you could fund it out of the jobs plan, which comes next, and preparing for it now would be quite helpful.
Yeah, that's great. So unfortunately, we've reached the end of our Q&A because we want to give everybody a chance to, our partners a chance to speak, and then Denny and I are going to close. But I wanted to make sure that everybody had this information that came from Treasury late on Thursday evening. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I want to make sure that everybody has time to speak, but they are encouraging those metro cities population over 50,000 to have a valid DUNS and SAMS registration, and should get their entity payment information around, as well as those non-entitlement units of government should also get their DUNS number, and then it's recommended that they register for SAM just to be safe. And you can see the link there if you want to go read more about those details. So. And then I'm going to turn it over now to Matt Greller, the Executive Director of Accelerate Indiana Municipalities.
Thanks, Andrea. Appreciate the invite to partner with you all. Bruce, good to hear you again. Bruce is no stranger to state municipal organizations like ours around the country. If you don't know his work, I would get to know it. Colin, I don't know you as well yet, but look forward to learning more about your work as well. I'll just reiterate, Andrea, what you put up on the screen. That's really the only concrete information we have right now in terms of how the money and what you can do to prepare. We sent it out to our membership yesterday morning. If you have questions, let us know. We'll try to walk you through those as quickly as we can. But the big picture and the planning process that Bruce and Colin talked about, I cannot emphasize that enough. You know generally where the money can be used. We'll wait for the specifics, but that should not hinder your efforts to begin the planning process yesterday if you have not already. So thanks to you, Andrea, Jenny, Okra, Brian, David, everybody. Appreciate being a part of the group.
Okay, and then
Good to see you,
David.
Matt.
Yeah, thanks. Dave Bauer with the Association of Indiana Counties. And again, what a great opportunity lies before us. This really is transformational money coming to local units of government. And plus what's going to be in the state budget, we feel like will also be of great assistance. So a lot of opportunities. And I know for us, our objective, I want it to be for Indiana, is that when all this money's been spent, if that's at the end of 2024, if there's an extension, we want Indiana to look back and be the model of how this money was supposed to be spent. We want to spend it better than any other state in the country. We want really this to be transformational because it is a once in a lifetime generation, and we'll have to work with our partners at Okra and the state and communities, leaders, as mentioned previously. Everybody needs to be brought to the table and help identify the goals and objectives of each community. But very excited about the opportunity to work with Okra and the state. But it's just going to be a lot of fun, I think, to spend this money wisely and then look back years from now to say we did it better than anybody else. So I think that should be our objective. So thanks.
Okay, and then Brian Long.
IR too would like to thank everyone for putting this on. It's going to be very helpful to our members as well. I would like to address one point though before we sign off. And the questions came up earlier about working together on a regional basis. And here in Indiana, we already have in place 16 regional councils where multiple governments are very accustomed working together. And our role traditionally as regional councils has been to work with local governments to secure grant funding and to financial aid. And in particular, we've had a major role during catastrophes and recovery periods. That seems to be when our services that are most in need, and we're certainly going to be experiencing that. So we do look to being able to address some of these problems on a regional basis. Some of our members, over half of them, have already received additional funding from EDA to staff up, add staff to be able to work with you and get additional funding. And also during the CARES Act, they received funding, 8 of them at least, half of them received funding to start resiliency planning and to put a task force in place for that planning. And I might say that that resiliency planning task force looks an awful lot like the command center that was described earlier. So might be able, and this to be able to work on a regional basis does not preclude individual cities and towns addressing their needs on an individual basis. So it's like they can do both. But I did want to point that out because we were working very hard. We had a couple hours meeting this morning talking about some of this. So we are working to be ready. We know many of the smallest communities, rural communities, aren't going to have staff to do this, and even some of the mid-sized communities, and we are preparing to help out.
Thank you, Brian. And again, thank you to Brian and David and Matt, AIM and AIC and IARC for being part of this, but mostly thank you very much to Bruce and Colin. Today's webinar is just the start of our effort at Okra to help develop be your partners in focusing and creating a sustainable program in this new opportunity we have. Based on the new dynamics of the ARPA funds and with the support of Lieutenant Governor Suzanne Crouch, I want to tell you that the Stellar Communities program is being repurposed. We need to rethink where we are as an agency and to be your partner. Capacity building and planning has always been integral to our mission. So the principles and the spirit of what Stellar Communities was and made a successful program will exist in any current and future programming. So we're working on that. As the Director of Strategic Initiatives, Andrea is responsible for utilizing those principles, and then a new program focusing on supporting communities will be developed to use the ARPA funds. And before Andrea closes it out, I do want to give Bruce and Colin one more, if any parting words of wisdom for our group. Guys, we can't tell you how much we Hoosiers appreciate you taking the time today to come and share your thoughts and wisdom with us. We appreciate it so much, guys.
I mean, I think you are ready to roll. I mean, just based on the comments and the chat. I mean, bottom line, don't overthink this. Just get your arms around, a portion of it and just set those local priorities. Just be completely selfish about what is motivating your communities, how you've been impacted, and then match up to the federal money. So I think Indiana's a great state. I think you can get this done.
Yeah, what Bruce said.
It's great. So I just want to take a moment and echo all of today's speakers' points about this tremendous opportunity for local governments. This legislation truly presents a once-in-a-generation opportunity for our communities, and the decisions that all of you make over the next 3.5 years will not only serve you to recover from the current crisis, but could permanently shape your community's economic development capability and growth trajectory for the next decade and beyond. We know that you're just beginning to evaluate the eligible uses of these funds and starting to prioritize your specific community needs. And we want to continue to stress the need to be strategic and the importance of engaging your whole community in that decision-making process. With that said, as Denny mentioned, we are developing a program to help communities that want to be strategic about planning for and deploying their local funds to best leverage the full offering of federal funds and other buckets of funding within ARPA. We're engaging the tremendous expertise and knowledge of Ball State University's Indiana Communities Institute, IU Center for Rural Engagement, and Purdue Center for Regional Development on this initiative. That program will utilize community engagement, prior planning, asset building, and collaboration to prepare communities to implement strategic investment plans. This initiative will serve as the pinnacle program for community and economic development for individual communities and regions in the state. You can expect to see more information, and the program guidelines will be announced in May. So finally, I just want to give a huge thank you to Bruce for joining us today, and our partners at AIM and AIC and IARC for joining us as well. We're so lucky at Okra to get to work with communities from all over the state and to see your passion, drive, and enthusiasm. We're looking forward to continuing to support each of you as you work towards your goals, and we learn so much from all of you. I personally take great pleasure in having the opportunity to work alongside all of you. So thank you for joining us and contributing to our discussion today. We'll be sending out an email to everyone who registered for the event with the recording and a brief post-webinar survey, which I've posted in the chat. We will also be posting the recording on our YouTube channel and website, so you can look for that in the next couple of days. So that's all. Thanks so much for spending the last hour with us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.